The envelope was inside the wall, not hidden behind it, not tucked into a drawer nearby, but sealed inside the plaster and lathed between the kitchen and the hallway, exactly where only someone repairing the house would ever find it. My wife had been dead for 3.5 years when I pulled it out, and her handwriting on the front was so steady, so deliberate, that for a moment I forgot she was gone. It said, "Open this when they come for the house." I held it under the work light I had clamped to the exposed stud and read the words again. The plaster dust was still settling around me, white and fine as flour, covering my forearms and the front of my shirt and the old leather tool belt I had been wearing for so many years that the brass buckle had worn a permanent groove into the hide. The envelope was a standard legal size, cream-colored, sealed with clear tape across the flap. In the particular way Maggie sealed everything she considered important. 2 strips crossed and pressed flat with her thumbnail. I could see the faint crescent mark her nail had left in the tape. 3.5 years dead, and she was still leaving her fingerprints on things I had not yet found. I did not open it. That is the part most people would not understand, so I will explain. The envelope said to open it when they come for the house. No one had come for the house. I did not know who they were. I did not know what coming for it would look like. But Maggie had written those words with the same precision she brought to everything. And if she said when, she meant when and not before. So I brushed the plaster dust off with my sleeve, carried the envelope to the kitchen, and placed it in the top drawer of the table beside the window that looks out over the Hudson. The drawer where Maggie used to keep her reading glasses and a small notebook for recording the birds she saw on the river in the mornings. I went back to the wall and continued the repair. That is who I am. My name is Walter Simmons. Most people have called me Walt for so long that the full name sounds like it belongs to someone I used to know. I am 67 years old, and I have spent 40 of those years restoring old houses. Not building new ones, restoring them. There is a difference that most people do not care about, and that I have never been able to stop caring about. Building is the act of making something exist. Restoring is the act of refusing to let something stop existing. I have always been more drawn to the second. I have restored colonial farmhouses in Dutchess County, with hand-hewn beams that were already 200 years old when I first touched them. I have rebuilt the porch of a church in Cold Spring that was sagging so badly the congregation had started using the back door, and when I pulled up the floorboards I found a newspaper from 1891 pressed flat between the joists, still legible, still carrying news that mattered to someone who had been dead for over a century. I have replaced window sashes in a schoolhouse in Rhinebeck, where the original glass still had the ripples of glass made by hand, and I kept every pane and reglazed them because the way light passes through old glass is not the same as through new glass, and the difference matters even if no one can explain exactly why. I was good at this work because I understood something that took me years to learn. The first step in restoring an old house is not measuring. It is not inspecting. It is standing still and listening, because every old house is trying to tell you something, and the ones that have been neglected the longest have the most to say. Every old house has a story worth retelling. The crime is not that they fall apart. Everything falls apart. Wood rots. Stone shifts. Plaster cracks along lines that follow the settling of the earth beneath the foundation. That is not a crime. That is time doing what time does. The crime is when no one bothers to listen to what the house has been holding before they decide to tear it down. I said that to a reporter once, years ago, when the county was debating whether to demolish an old stone bridge. The reporter printed the quote, and the bridge was saved. Maggie cut the article out and taped it to the refrigerator, where it stayed for 11 years until the tape gave out and it fell behind the stove. I found it after she died, dusty and curled, still carrying her fingerprints on the edges where she had held it. Her fingerprints. Always her fingerprints. On the article behind the stove. On the tape across the envelope. On every surface of this house I touch in the course of a day. Which is most of them, because this house is not large, and Maggie lived in it for the better part of her life. And she touched everything, with the careful attention of someone who believed the things you put your hands on become part of you. I understood that afternoon, standing in the kitchen with plaster dust drying on my skin, and the envelope in the drawer, and the late October light coming through the window at the angle it only reaches in autumn, that something in this house was telling me what I had been refusing to hear. Not the walls. The walls were sound. The foundation had not shifted more than a quarter inch in 100 years. The roof I reshingled 2 summers ago was tight. No. What I had been ignoring were the bones that connected me to the people I loved and the people who were supposed to love me back. I had spent 40 years listening to old houses tell me where they hurt. I had spent considerably less time listening to the silence on the other end of the phone when my son stopped calling. I would learn what that silence meant soon enough. The answer was already in motion, being planned with the efficiency of someone who had been practicing for this kind of work. And the envelope in the drawer, the one my dead wife had hidden inside a wall she knew only I would ever repair, was the only thing standing between 100 years of memory and a signature on a contract I had never agreed to sign. But I did not know that yet. That afternoon I finished the repair, cleaned my tools, and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee while the sun dropped behind the ridge across the Hudson. The river turned the deep amber it always turns in October, and the trees on the opposite bank were at the peak of their change. Red and gold, and the particular burnt orange that only sugar maples produce. The color Maggie used to say looked like the earth was showing off. I drank my coffee. I watched the river. I did not know that in 6 weeks I would be sitting in a restaurant while a woman I had met 7 times explained to 35 people that my home had already been sold, that my life in this house was being converted into a number on a check. I did not know that. But Maggie had known. She had put the answer inside the wall and waited for me to find it the way she always waited for me to find things, patiently, with the quiet certainty that I would get there eventually, even if it took me longer than it should have. It took Maggie 4 minutes to find the document I needed the day we met. I know because I was watching the clock above the reference desk at the Beacon Public Library, not out of impatience, but out of the particular self-consciousness that comes from standing in a place you do not belong and waiting for someone to notice. It was 1985. I was 36 years old. Covered in sawdust that I had failed to brush entirely from my jacket, and I was looking for the original architectural drawings of a colonial farmhouse on Route 9 that the owner wanted restored, but could not describe beyond the words old and leaking. The woman behind the reference desk had silver-streaked brown hair pulled back with a pencil pushed through it, and she looked at me the way someone looks at a sentence they have already begun to understand before the other person finishes speaking it. I told her what I needed. She did not write it down. She stood, walked to the back of the local history section, climbed a step stool, pulled a flat archival box from the top shelf, opened it, and set the drawings on the table in front of me. 4 minutes. I had been looking for those drawings for 2 weeks. She found them in 4 minutes. Her name was Margaret Simmons. She had been the local history librarian at Beacon for 3 years. But she was not simply a librarian in the way most people use that word. She was a historian who happened to work in a library, which meant she did not just know where things were filed. She knew why they had been filed there, who had filed them, what else they had written, and whether the thing you were looking for was actually the thing you needed, or just the thing you thought you needed. That distinction mattered to her. It would take me years to understand how much it mattered. I asked her how she had found the drawings so quickly. She said she had been cataloging the architectural records of every historically significant structure in the county for the past 18 months, and that the farmhouse on Route 9 was file number 212. She said it like it was obvious. Like everyone, memorized file numbers. Like this was simply what a person did when they cared about something enough to pay attention. I asked her to dinner. She said no. She said she did not go to dinner with men who had sawdust on their collars. I came back the next day without sawdust. She said she had been joking about the sawdust, but that she appreciated the effort. We went to a diner on Main Street in Beacon and talked for 3 hours about houses, which sounds like a narrow subject until you realize that houses contain everything: birth and death and the distance between them, the meals that sustained people, and the arguments that divided them. The rooms where children slept, and the porches where old people watched the world change and decided it was still worth watching. Maggie understood houses differently than I did. I understood them as structures, as problems of load and material, and the physics of what holds a thing together when time and weather and neglect are trying to pull it apart. Maggie understood them as stories. She said every house is a narrative, and most people only read the cover. The paint color, the curb appeal, the square footage. But the actual story is in the layers, the wallpaper beneath the wallpaper beneath the plaster, the name scratched into the window frame by a child in 1927. The nail holes where someone hung a picture of a person they loved and then took it down and never hung anything there again. We married in 1986, 1 year after we met. We lived in the stone house on the Hudson that had been in her family since her grandfather built it in 1920. I moved into her world and she moved into mine. And the place where those two worlds overlapped was the house itself, which she studied, and I maintained, and we both loved in our different and completely compatible ways. 38 years. I will not try to summarize 38 years of marriage in a paragraph, because that would be an insult to both of us. What I will say is this. There are marriages that work because the two people agree on everything, and there are marriages that work because the two people disagree on everything but have agreed on the one thing that matters, which is that the disagreement itself is interesting enough to sustain a life. Ours was the second kind. She believed the story of a house was more important than its structure. I believed the structure was what allowed the story to survive. We argued about this for 38 and we were both right. The entire time. And knowing we were both right was what made it worth arguing about. She was diagnosed with lung cancer in the spring, 4 years before this story begins. She had never smoked a single cigarette in her life. Not one. The oncologist explained the statistics, the percentage of lung cancer patients who have never smoked, the environmental factors, the genetics. Maggie listened politely and then said that she was not particularly interested in the statistics and that she would prefer to spend whatever time she had left finishing her research on the house. The research. I need to tell you about the research, because without it, nothing that comes later makes sense. Maggie had spent 20 years documenting the history of our house, the stone house on the Hudson that her grandfather Pietro Ferraro built in 1920. 20 years of interviews, courthouse records, immigration files, census data, handwritten letters she tracked down from the descendants of families who had passed through the house in its early years. 14 journals, each one filled with her careful handwriting and pressed leaves and photographs, and the slow, patient accumulation of a story that most people would have considered unimportant and that Maggie considered essential. She died in the reading room on the first floor. The room with the largest window, the one that faces the river. It was April. The window was open. The dogwoods along the bank were blooming, white against the gray water, and the air coming through the screen carried the particular smell of the Hudson in spring, which is mud and green, and something older than both. Her hand was resting on the 14th journal, the last one, open to a page she had been writing on that morning. I do not know what the last words she wrote were because I have not been able to read that page. Not yet. Some restorations take longer than others. She asked me to keep the house. She made me promise. Not in the dramatic way people make promises in movies, with tears and trembling voices and orchestral music underneath. She said it the way she said most important things. Quietly, clearly, as a statement of fact that did not require agreement, because it was already true. She said, "This house has kept people safe for 100 years, and I need you to make sure it keeps doing that." I promised. I kept that promise every single day for 3.5 years, repairing what needed repairing, maintaining what needed maintaining, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the river change colors the way it does. Always the same river, always a different color. I kept that promise until the evening a woman my son had married stood up at a restaurant in Cold Spring and told 35 people that the house was already sold, that the paperwork was handled, and that I should be grateful they had found me a comfortable place in Arizona where the weather would be good for my joints. She used Maggie's name when she said it. She said Maggie would have wanted me to be happy. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, with confidence and volume, and the absolute certainty of someone who has never been wrong because they have never cared enough about the truth to check. The house was not designed by an architect. It was built in 1920 by a man named Pietro Ferraro, who did not speak English, who had arrived in this country from a village outside Naples with a set of masonry tools wrapped in a canvas bag and the name of a foreman in Peekskill, who was hiring stoneworkers for the new reservoir dam. Pietro was 24 years old. He had been a stonemason in Italy since he was 14, which meant he had spent a decade learning how stone behaves, how it bears weight, where it wants to crack, and where it wants to hold, which is knowledge that cannot be taught in a classroom because stone does not read textbooks. Stone only responds to hands that have touched enough of it to understand what it is saying. The foreman in Peekskill hired him. The work was brutal. 10 hours a day cutting and hauling stone in heat that Pietro had not expected because someone had told him New York was cold. Which it is, but only for half the year, and the other half it is something else entirely. He worked the damn job for 7 months and saved enough money to buy a narrow strip of land on the east bank of the Hudson, 12 miles south of Beacon, where the river bends and the bluff drops down to a rocky shore lined with sycamores, and the particular gray-green willows that grow nowhere else in the valley with quite the same shape. He built the house himself. Not with lumber, which he could not afford, and not with brick, which he did not trust because he had seen what happened to brick buildings in the earthquakes back home. He built it with stone he carried on his back from the riverbank, fieldstone and bluestone, and the flat gray slabs of shale that line the Hudson shore, each one selected by hand and fitted without mortar for the first 3 courses, because Pietro believed a foundation should be able to breathe. He laid the mortar above the 3rd course using a lime mix recipe his father had taught him, and the walls went up over the course of 4 months, 2 feet thick, with window openings framed in oak he traded labor to acquire from a sawmill in Garrison. The house was small. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, a kitchen with a stone hearth that drew perfectly from the first fire because Pietro understood draft and flue angles the way a musician understands intervals. The roof was slate, carried from a quarry in Vermont by a man who owed Pietro a favor for helping him set a chimney in Croton. Everything about the house was built from exchanges, favors traded, debts honored, the economy of people who have nothing but their skills and the willingness to use them for each other. That is the part Maggie loved most. Not the architecture, though she appreciated the architecture. What she loved was the web of human connection the house represented. Every stone in the wall was a relationship. Every beam was a negotiation. The house did not just shelter the man who built it. It was built from the collected goodwill of a community of people who were all, in their own ways, trying to survive in a place that had not yet decided whether it wanted them. By 1923, the house had become something Pietro had not planned. The Bear Mountain Bridge was under construction, the first vehicular bridge to cross the Hudson south of Albany. And the labor force was enormous. Hundreds of workers, many of them immigrants like Pietro, Italian and Irish and Polish and Hungarian men who had come for the work and had nowhere to stay that did not charge them most of their wages. Pietro's house was 12 miles from the bridge site, close enough to reach by truck in the morning. And Pietro had a kitchen with a stove and a well with clean water, and a wife named Lucia who could make enough pasta to feed 12 men from a sack of flour and a handful of salt. The house became a way station. That was Maggie's word for it. Not a boarding house, because no one paid. Not a shelter, because the men who came were not destitute. They were working. They were earning. It was a way station. A place between where they had come from and where they were going. A place where a man could eat a meal at a table with other men who understood what it meant to carry stone on your back in a country whose language you were still learning to speak. Maggie spent 20 years documenting this history. 20 years. Most people cannot sustain interest in anything for 20 months. And Maggie spent 20 years tracking down the descendants of the families who had passed through Pietro's house, searching immigration records at Ellis Island, cross-referencing census data, writing letters to historical societies in small towns across the Northeast, where the bridge workers had eventually settled. She found baptismal records. She found photographs she had to get permission to copy from elderly women who kept them in shoeboxes, in closets, in apartments, in the Bronx, and in Newark, and in Bridgeport. She found a letter written in 1924 by a Hungarian carpenter named András Kovács to his wife in Budapest, in which he described the stone house by the river, where an Italian man and his wife fed him dinner every night for 3 weeks and would not accept a single cent. 14 journals, each one filled with Maggie's handwriting. That small, precise script that leaned slightly to the right, as if the words themselves were in a hurry to get to the next page. She pressed leaves between the pages, samples from the sycamores and willows along the riverbank, and she taped photographs to the margins and wrote dates beneath them, and drew small maps showing where each family had come from and where they had gone after the bridge was finished. The journals were not academic. They were not organized by any system I could identify. They were organized by the logic of someone who loved the material so deeply that she could hold the entire narrative in her head and did not need an index because she was the index. Those 14 journals sat on the shelf in the reading room where she died. I had looked at them many times in the 3.5 years since. I had picked them up, held them, run my thumb across the edges of the pages, the way you touch something that belongs to someone you have lost. But I had not read them all. Not cover to cover. Not in order. I told myself I was saving them, that reading them slowly, over time, was a way of keeping Maggie's voice alive in the house for a little longer, the way you ration the last of something precious, because once it is gone, it is gone. That was partly true. The other part, the part I did not admit to myself until much later, was that I was afraid of what I would find in them. Not afraid of the history. Afraid of how much Maggie had known. Afraid of how far ahead she had seen. Afraid that somewhere in those 14 journals was evidence that she had understood exactly what was coming for this house and had spent the last years of her life quietly, methodically, without telling me, making sure it would survive. She had. But I was not ready to know that yet. What I did know was that someone out there had looked at this house that Pietro Ferraro built with river stone and immigrant hands, this house that had sheltered families and fed workers and held 100 years of memory in its walls, and they had seen a number, a lot value, a demolition opportunity, a line item in a development proposal, and they had sent someone I loved to deliver the message. Change does not arrive all at once. I have learned this from 40 years of working on houses that are falling apart. A house does not collapse in a single moment. It collapses in 1,000 small moments that nobody notices. A shingle loosens in a storm, and nobody replaces it. Rain gets under the tar paper. The sheathing darkens. The rafter beneath it softens. A year later, another shingle goes. Then 2 more. Then the ceiling in the upstairs bedroom shows a stain the size of a quarter that someone covers with a coat of paint instead of climbing onto the roof to find the source. By the time the ceiling sags, by the time the plaster gives way and the water comes through in earnest, the damage is years old, and the cost of repairing it is 10 times what it would have been if someone had replaced that first shingle on the day it came loose. My son was a house I stopped maintaining. I say that with no pride and full responsibility for the metaphor. His name is James. He is 42 years old. He has his mother's eyes, the particular dark brown that looks almost black in low light. And he has my hands, broad across the knuckles, the kind of hands that were made to hold tools, and that now hold nothing heavier than a phone. He was a good boy. He was a curious, thoughtful, somewhat quiet boy who liked building model ships at the kitchen table, and who would sit for hours in the reading room with Maggie while she worked on her journals, not because he was told to, but because he found it genuinely interesting. He asked questions. He remembered the answers. When he was 12, he told his 7th grade history teacher that the Bear Mountain Bridge was built primarily by immigrant labor, and that his great-great-grandfather had fed many of the workers in his own kitchen, and the teacher had to look it up because she did not know. He studied history at the State University in New Paltz, 30 minutes from our house. Close enough that he came home most weekends. He helped Maggie with her research. He helped me with restorations. Not as a career, but as a son who understood that the work his father did was worth understanding. He had Maggie's patience and my stubbornness, and the combination made him the kind of person who could sit with a problem until the problem revealed its own solution. Then he moved to Austin, Texas, to work for a technology consulting firm. That was 7 years ago. Then he married Victoria. That was 5 years ago. And then, slowly, in increments so small I could not see them accumulating, he became someone else. I do not know how to describe Victoria without sounding like a man who blames a woman for his son's choices. I have spent considerable time thinking about this, and I have concluded that the most honest approach is to describe what I observed and let the observations speak for themselves. Victoria works in luxury real estate marketing. She is intelligent. She is articulate. She is extremely skilled at presenting things in the most favorable possible light, which is a professional asset and a personal quality that I found unsettling from the first dinner we shared, because I have spent my life working with materials that cannot be made to look like something they are not. Wood is wood. Stone is stone. You can polish them, you can finish them, but you cannot make oak into mahogany or limestone into marble. And if someone tells you they can, they are selling something. Victoria was always selling something. At that first dinner, she sold me on her devotion to James. At the second, she sold me on her interest in the house, asking questions about the history that felt rehearsed, and looking at the stone walls with an expression I now recognize as appraisal rather than appreciation. By the third visit, she had stopped asking about the house entirely and was instead talking about property values in the Hudson Valley, about the development boom, about waterfront parcels that were selling for numbers. She recited with the specific reverence some people reserve for scripture. James stopped calling on Sundays. That was the first shingle. It happened 3 months after the wedding, and I told myself he was busy. That married life requires adjustment. That a man does not owe his father a weekly phone call just because it has been a habit since college. I told myself this, and I believed it because I wanted to believe it. He stopped coming to the house for Thanksgiving. That was the second shingle. Victoria preferred to host, she said. Their condo in Austin had a proper dining room. The drive to Hudson Valley was too long. The house was cold in November. The reasons were always reasonable. They were always delivered with a smile. They always made sense if you did not look at them too carefully, and I did not look at them too carefully, because looking carefully at things that hurt is a skill I have always applied more faithfully to houses than to people. He stopped talking about history. He stopped mentioning his mother's research. He stopped asking me about my work. The conversations became shorter, more logistical, less like a father and son and more like two people who share a last name and an obligation to acknowledge that fact periodically. I would call and ask how he was, and he would say fine in the way people say fine when they are not fine, but have decided that fine is the only word they are authorized to use. The woman he married had replaced every habit, preference, and reference point he once held with ones she had selected for him, and she had done it so gradually that he did not notice, and I did not intervene, because I kept telling myself the same 2 words I have told myself about every problem I did not want to face. Probably nothing. Probably nothing when he canceled the trip home for Maggie's birthday, the first one after she died. Probably nothing when Victoria mentioned at Christmas that assisted living communities in the Southwest had excellent amenities for active seniors. Probably nothing when I called one evening 8 months ago and heard Victoria in the background, her voice pitched just below conversational volume, but clear enough for me to hear, saying that crumbling money pit is going to bankrupt us if your father does not come to his senses. James said he had to go. The call ended. I sat on the porch and looked at the river, and I added that phrase to the collection of things I had filed away in the part of my mind reserved for observations I was not yet willing to examine. Crumbling money pit. That is what she called this house. This house, where Pietro Ferraro mixed lime mortar with hands that had crossed an ocean. This house where Lucia fed bridge workers pasta from a sack of flour. This house where Maggie sat in the reading room for 20 years and listened to its story with the patience of someone who believed every story deserves to be heard. This house where I had promised my dying wife I would keep the walls standing and the doors open and the memory alive. Crumbling money pit. I should have driven to Austin that night. I should have sat across from my son and asked him directly what was happening and why he had allowed it to happen, and whether he remembered who he used to be. I should have replaced that first shingle the day it came loose. I did not. I told myself it was probably nothing. And 8 months later, Victoria sent 35 invitations to a gathering at a restaurant in Cold Spring, and I received mine in the mail with a note written in her handwriting that said, "Family celebration. Please come, casual dress. There are things that happen in your house while you are not home that you only learn about later when the evidence has already settled into the grain of the wood like a stain you cannot sand out. I know this because I have pulled up floorboards in houses and found damage that the owners never knew existed. Pipes that had been leaking for years inside walls, termites that had eaten through a sill plate, while the family above it slept and ate and lived their lives without hearing a thing. The damage does not announce itself. It simply continues, quietly, until something gives. I went to Poughkeepsie every 3 months for a checkup at the VA Medical Center. Routine blood work, blood pressure, the kind of appointment that takes 40 minutes of actual medical attention and 3 hours of waiting and driving and sitting in a waiting room reading magazines that are always 6 months old. I had been going on the same schedule for years, and I had mentioned this schedule to James during one of our increasingly brief phone calls, and James had apparently mentioned it to Victoria. And Victoria had apparently determined that a man who leaves his house reliably every 3 months on a predictable day creates a window of opportunity. I do not know exactly when she first brought people to the house. I know when I first found the evidence, which was a Thursday in September, the day after my most recent appointment, when I came downstairs in the morning and noticed 3 things that did not belong. The first was a scuff mark on the hardwood floor in the front parlor. It was small, a crescent-shaped mark roughly the width of a pencil. The kind of mark made by the tip of a high heel, pivoting on a surface that was never designed for high heels. I had refinished that floor myself 2 years ago, hand-sanded and sealed with 3 coats of tung oil, and I knew every mark on it the way a parent knows every freckle on a child's face. That mark had not been there when I left for Poughkeepsie. Someone had walked through my parlor in heels while I was gone. The second was a smell. Not strong, not obvious, but present in the way certain perfumes remain present in a room hours after the person wearing them has left. It was a floral scent with something sharper underneath, the kind of fragrance that comes in a bottle designed to be displayed on a vanity rather than used. It was not Maggie's smell. Maggie wore lavender soap from a shop in Cold Spring, and nothing else, and the scent of that soap had faded from the house within the first year of her absence, which I grieved more than I expected. This new smell was not lavender. It was not soap. It was expensive and deliberate. And it did not belong in a house where the only scents should have been wood oil and river air and the faint camphor of the old cedar closet upstairs. The third was a business card. It had fallen behind the hall table near the front door, the narrow table where Maggie used to keep a bowl of keys and a small vase of whatever was blooming in the garden. The bowl and the vase were still there. I had not changed them because changing them would have meant admitting they no longer served their purpose. The business card was wedged between the table leg and the baseboard, standing on its edge, as if it had been dropped in haste and kicked accidentally into the gap. I pulled it out and read it. Sterling River Development. Turning the Hudson Valley's potential into premier living experiences. Beneath the tagline was a name and a phone number and a small logo of a river rendered in silver ink that was meant to look elegant and instead looked like the river had been focus grouped into something no one who actually lived near it would recognize. I held the card in my hand for a long time. I stood in the hallway of my house, the house Pietro built, the house Maggie studied, the house I had promised to keep, and I held a business card from a developer who wanted to turn it into something called a premier living experience, and I felt the particular cold clarity that comes when you realize the thing you have been telling yourself is probably nothing, is, in fact, something. Something that has been happening in your house while you were in a waiting room in Poughkeepsie reading a magazine from March. I did what I always do. I filed it away. I put the business card in the top drawer of the hall table, next to a stack of Maggie's old garden catalogs I had not thrown away. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Maybe James had mentioned the house to a colleague. Maybe a developer had come by unsolicited, the way they do in the Hudson Valley now that every acre of riverfront land has become a target for people who see water views and calculate returns. Maybe the scuff mark was from my own boot, at an angle I did not remember. Maybe the smell was from a neighbor who had stopped by. Probably nothing. But I started paying attention in a way I had not been paying attention before. And paying attention, for a man who has spent his life noticing the small things that other people walk past without seeing, is not a casual shift. It is a door opening. Once you start looking, you cannot stop. And what you find behind the door is usually worse than what you imagined was there. Over the next several weeks, I found two more things. The first was a set of photographs on Victoria's public social media page, which I had never looked at before, and which James's neighbor in Austin, a woman named Deb, who still sent me Christmas cards because she had met Maggie once and liked her, had mentioned in a note. The photographs showed Victoria, at a real estate industry event in Manhattan, shaking hands with a man whose name tag read Sterling River Development, dated 4 months before the business card appeared in my hallway. She was smiling. He was smiling. They looked like people who had already agreed on something and were celebrating the agreement. The second was a voicemail left on my landline while I was outside splitting firewood. It was from a number I did not recognize. A wolf voice, professional and pleasant, said she was calling from a firm called Dutchess County Premier Appraisals, and that she wanted to confirm the appointment for the property assessment that had been scheduled for the following Tuesday. She said the client of record was Victoria, and she left a callback number. I did not call back. I did not confront anyone. I sat on the porch that evening and watched the river, and I thought about the envelope in the drawer, the one that said, "Open this when they come for the house." I thought about the word when, not if. When. Maggie had not written if they come. She had written when. She had known it was not a question of possibility. It was a question of timing. They were coming. The scuff mark and the perfume and the business card and the photographs and the voicemail were the first shingles coming loose, and I could either climb onto the roof now or I could wait for the ceiling to fall. I waited. Not because I was passive. Not because I was afraid. I waited because the invitation to Cold Spring had already arrived, and it was dated for 6 days from now, and because I have learned from 40 years of restoration that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let the damage reveal its full extent before you begin the repair. Victoria chose a restaurant with a view of the river. It sat on a bluff above the Metro North tracks in Cold Spring, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and reclaimed wood tables and a wine list that uses adjectives like expressive and a menu that does not list prices. Because the assumption is that if you need to know the price, you probably should not be eating there. The windows faced west, directly across the Hudson, and from the long table Victoria had reserved, you could see the ridge on the far side, turning the deep russet of late October. The same ridge I watched every evening from my porch. The same river, the same light, seen from a different angle, and surrounded by people paying $22 for a cocktail to look at it. I arrived early because I always arrive early. It is a habit from restoration work, where being first on the job site means you get 30 minutes of quiet before the noise starts. I sat at the end of the long table nearest the window and watched the staff set places for 35. 35. I counted the chairs twice. Victoria had invited 35 people to what her invitation had called a family celebration, and I remember thinking that our family consisted of 3 living members which meant she had invited 32 additional witnesses to whatever she was planning. And people do not assemble audiences unless they intend to perform. They arrived in clusters. Carol and Dennis from the Garden Society, who had been Maggie's closest friends, and who hugged me and asked about the willow along the riverbank and whether the foxes were still denning under the north porch. Frank Hobson, who had worked with me on the church restoration in Cold Spring 20 years ago, and whose hands shook now from Parkinson's, but whose eye for plum was still better than most men half his age. Maggie's cousin Eleanor and her husband, who drove down from Albany. Neighbors, old colleagues, people who had known Maggie, who had known the house, who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at the long pine table in the kitchen, where Maggie put candles in the windows, and Pietro's stone walls held the warmth of the oven like a kiln. Victoria had invited every person who mattered to me. I understood that later as strategy. At the time, I simply thought she was being generous, which tells you something about how thoroughly I had trained myself not to see what was directly in front of me. James arrived with Victoria. He was wearing a jacket I did not recognize, something slim and dark that looked like it had been chosen by someone other than him, because the James I wore flannel and broke-in boots and did not own clothing that required dry cleaning. He shook my hand instead of hugging me, which was new, and he said it was good to see me, which was the kind of thing you say to a colleague at a conference, not to your father. His eyes moved to Victoria, and then back to me, and then to the table, and he sat down across from me and picked up his wine glass and began rotating it slowly between his fingers. The dinner proceeded normally for the first 40 minutes. Appetizers arrived. Conversations overlapped. Carol told a story about Maggie and a raccoon that had gotten into the compost bin, and everyone laughed, and for a moment the evening felt like what the invitation had promised, a gathering of people who shared a history and were glad to be reminded of it. Then Victoria stood up. She tapped her wine glass with a fork, the universal signal for a speech, and the table went quiet. She smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, wide and practiced, and calibrated to project warmth at a distance, the smile of someone who has given presentations in boardrooms and knows exactly how long to pause before delivering the key message. She said she wanted to thank everyone for coming. She said family was the most important thing. She said that she and James had been thinking about the future, about what was best for everyone, and that they had made a decision that was difficult but necessary, and that she believed, truly believed, would bring peace and comfort to the people she loved. She said the house had been listed with a broker affiliated with Sterling River Development. She said the terms were favorable. She said the property had been assessed at $1.2 million and that a purchase agreement had been signed pending final walkthrough. She said construction would begin in the spring on a boutique riverside resort that would bring jobs and tourism to the area. She said they had found a wonderful community for me in Scottsdale, Arizona. She said the climate would be easier on my joints. She said the community had a woodworking shop and a library and social activities, and that she had personally toured the facility, and it was beautiful. She said I would make friends. Then she said the thing that made me understand. She said Maggie would have wanted this. She said Maggie would have wanted me to be comfortable. She said Maggie would have wanted me to stop living alone in a house that was too much for one person to maintain. She said Maggie's name 3 times in 4 sentences, and each time she said it the way you use a key, inserting it into a lock you believe you have the right to open. The table had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when the air pressure changes before a storm. Carol was looking at her plate. Frank Hobson was looking at me. Eleanor had put her hand on her husband's arm. 35 people sat in silence and listened to a woman they had met between 1 and 4 times explain to them what Maggie would have wanted. James was rotating his wine glass. He had not looked up since Victoria started speaking. He was staring at the stem of the glass with the focused attention of a man who has memorized his lines but has decided not to deliver them, which is not the same as disagreeing with the script. It is simply the cowardice of letting someone else say the words you are not brave enough to say yourself. I looked at the river through the window. The sun was low enough now that the water had turned from amber to something deeper, a color that has no name in the paint charts. I have consulted over 40 years of matching finishes, a color that belongs only to the Hudson at this hour in October. The same color Maggie used to watch from the reading room window. The same river. The same light. I set my napkin on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I said, very quietly, that the house was not for sale, that no broker had the authority to list it, and that the woman who had just used my dead wife's name to justify selling her family home had made a very serious miscalculation. Victoria's smile held. It held the way a cracked beam holds, out of habit and tension, rather than structural integrity. She began to respond. Something about legal counsel and practical decisions and the burden of maintenance costs. I excused myself. I told the table I needed to step outside for a moment. I pushed my chair back, walked past 35 people who were watching me with the expression of witnesses who have just realized the event they came to attend has become something else entirely, and I stepped through the front door into the October evening. The air outside smelled like wood smoke and cold water, and the particular mineral scent of the Hudson at low tide. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. The number I needed was saved under a name I had not called in 3.5 years. Not because I had forgotten it, because I had hoped I would never need to use it. I pressed call. Helen Garza answered on the second ring. She did not say hello. She did not ask who was calling. She said 5 words in a voice that carried the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting for a specific phone call and has spent the waiting time preparing rather than worrying. She said, "I wondered when this call would come." I told her what had happened. I told her about the restaurant and the 35 guests and the speech, and the $1.2 million and the Sterling River development, and the boutique Riverside Resort, and the Scottsdale, Arizona community with the woodworking shop, and the library, and the activities. I told her about Victoria using Maggie's name. I said that part last because it was the part that mattered most, and because saying it out loud made it real in a way that hearing it at the table had not. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Go home. Open the envelope. I will be there in the morning." I asked her what was in the envelope. She said she could not tell me that because Maggie had asked her not to, and she had given Maggie her word. She said Maggie had been very specific about how this would work. She said the envelope was Maggie's to give, and hers to protect, and mine to open, and that the order mattered. I asked her how long she had known about the envelope. She said since before Maggie died. She said Maggie had contacted her 2 years before her death and asked for her help with a project that required legal expertise in historic preservation and land protection. She said she and Maggie had worked on it together over the course of 14 months, meeting at the house when I was out on restoration jobs, communicating through letters rather than email because Maggie preferred paper, and because paper, Maggie had said, is harder to accidentally find on someone else's screen. I stood in the parking lot of the restaurant in Cold Spring with my phone against my ear and the October wind coming off the river, and I listened to a woman tell me that my dead wife had spent the last 2 years of her life building something I did not know about, with the help of a person I had barely spoken to, using methods I would not have suspected, to protect a house from a threat she had seen coming long before I was willing to look. Helen said, "Go home, Walt. Open the envelope, and then get some sleep, because tomorrow is going to be a long day." She said it without drama. She said it the way a contractor says it when the demolition is scheduled for morning and the prep work needs to be done tonight. I said I understood. She said she knew I did. The call lasted 4 minutes. The same amount of time it had taken Maggie to find those architectural drawings in the library in 1985. I did not think that was a coincidence. I do not think Maggie would have thought so either. I went back inside. I rejoined the table as if nothing had changed, which required a kind of performance I am not naturally equipped for, but which I managed, because the alternative was showing my hand before I understood what cards I was holding. I sat down. I picked up my water glass. I asked Carol about her daughter's new job in Portland. I listened to Frank Hobson tell a story about a chimney he rebuilt in 1993 that was still drawing perfectly. I ate a piece of the chocolate cake the restaurant had brought out for the occasion, though I do not remember what it tasted like. Victoria watched me from the far end of the table with the expression of a woman who is waiting for surrender and interpreting its absence as confusion. She had expected a reaction. She had expected argument or tears, or the bewildered compliance of an old man confronted with decisions that had already been made on his behalf. What she got instead was a man eating chocolate cake and asking about chimney repair, and I could see the miscalculation working its way through her confidence like a crack spreading slowly through a load-bearing wall. James found me in the parking lot after dessert. I was standing beside my truck, a 2004 Ford that Maggie used to say looked like it had been through a war, and I used to say looked like it had character, which is the same thing said by two different kinds of people. He walked toward me with his hands in the pockets of that slim, dark jacket, and he stood beside me, and we both looked at the river for a moment without speaking. He said he was sorry about how it had come out. He said the timing was bad. He said they had discussed it for months, and they genuinely believed it was the right decision. He said the maintenance on the property was significant. He said the roof would need work within 5 years. He said the foundation, and I stopped him there because the foundation of that house has not shifted more than a quarter inch in 100 years, and I was not going to stand in a parking lot and listen to my son repeat structural assessments he had been given by someone who had never put a level on a single wall. I asked him one question. I asked him whether he had read any of his mother's research journals. All 14 of them. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man thinking about his answer. It was the silence of a man who already knows his answer and is ashamed of it. He had not read them. He had not read a single one. 14 journals spanning 20 years of his mother's life, documenting the history of the house his great-great-grandfather built with river stone carried on his back. And he had not opened a single cover. He said he had been meaning to. He said there had not been time. He said things had been busy. I said I understood. I said good night. I did not say it coldly. I said it the way you say good night to someone you love, when you have just learned something about them that you need to sit with before you can respond to it properly. I got in my truck, and I drove home. The house was dark when I arrived. I turned on the kitchen light, the one Maggie had rigged from an old ship's lantern she found at an estate sale in Garrison. The kind of lantern that was designed to throw light in a storm, steady and warm, and impossible to blow out. I poured a glass of whiskey from the bottle I keep on the shelf above the stove, the one I open maybe 4 times a year. I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the top drawer. The envelope was where I had left it. Cream-colored. Sealed with 2 strips of tape crossed and pressed flat. Maggie's handwriting on the front, steady and deliberate. The handwriting of a woman who had never once in 38 years of marriage written a word she did not mean. Open this when they come for the house. They had come. They had come with a broker and a purchase agreement and a $1.2 million number and a speech that used my dead wife's name as a sales tool. They had come for the house. I broke the seal. 4 pages of handwriting. No crossed-out words. No corrections. No signs of hesitation or revision. Maggie had written this letter the way she did everything that mattered to her, with the calm thoroughness of someone who has thought about it long enough that the thinking is finished and the writing is simply the act of setting down what has already been decided. I spread the contents of the envelope across the kitchen table under the light of the ship's lantern. There were 4 items. The first was a document from the United States Department of the Interior, National Park Service, confirming that the property, at our address, had been entered into the National Register of Historic Places. The document was dated 14 months before Maggie died. It bore the signature of the State Historic Preservation Officer for New York and a reference number and the official seal that meant it was not a draft or an application, but a completed registration. The house was on the register. It had been on the register for nearly 5 years, and I had not known. The second item was a set of architectural drawings. Not copies. Originals. hand-drawn in pencil on drafting paper that had yellowed along the edges and softened at the folds from a century of handling. They were the original construction drawings for the house, dated 1920, and in the bottom right corner, in a hand I did not recognize, was written P. Ferraro, and beside it, in smaller letters, a note in Italian that I could not fully read, but that appeared to be a materials list. Maggie had found Pietro's original blueprints. She had found them, and she had not told me. And she had placed them in an envelope inside a wall and waited. The third item was a printed email. 1 page. From Victoria's email address to a contact at Sterling River Development. It was dated 5 months before Maggie died. The subject line read Hudson Valley Property, Preliminary Inquiry. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs long and professional in tone, and it described our house as a riverfront parcel with significant redevelopment potential, currently occupied by elderly family members, with an anticipated transfer timeline of 12 to 18 months. Anticipated transfer timeline. That was the phrase Victoria had used. 12 to 18 months. Maggie was still alive when Victoria wrote that email. Maggie was still sitting in the reading room working on her journals when Victoria was calculating how long it would take for her to die and for the property to become available. I set the email down on the table. I placed my hand flat on it for a moment. Not to hold it in place, but because I needed to press something. I needed the resistance of the table beneath my palm. I needed to feel something solid. The fourth item was the letter. 4 pages. Maggie's handwriting, the small, precise script that leaned slightly to the right, written in the blue-black ink of the fountain pen I had given her for our 20th anniversary, the one she used only for correspondence she considered permanent. She began, "My dear Walt, I am writing this in the reading room on a Tuesday in March. The dogwoods are not blooming yet, but the buds are visible, and I can see from here that this will be a good year for them. I want to tell you something I have not told you because I needed time to act before I explained, and because I know you. And I know that grief makes people act from anger. And I needed you to act from love. What I am about to tell you will make you angry. I am asking you to read all 4 pages before you decide what to do with that anger." She wrote that she had found the email on James's laptop. It was the Christmas before last. The last Christmas she was well enough to cook dinner, and James and Victoria had come to the house for 2 days. James had left his laptop open on the kitchen table while he went outside to help me clear brush along the riverbank. Maggie had not been looking for anything. She had been reaching for her reading glasses, which were beside the laptop, and the screen had been open to James's email, and Victoria's name was in the inbox. And the subject line said Hudson Valley Property. And Maggie, who had spent 20 years researching the history of things that other people overlooked, could not unsee a subject line like that. She read the email. She read the entire thread, which went back 3 months before that Christmas, and included messages between Victoria and a contact at Sterling River Development, and a separate thread between Victoria and a real estate attorney in Austin whose name Maggie did not recognize. The thread described the property. It described its value. It described the development potential. It described the current occupants as elderly, and one of them in declining health, and it described a timeline that assumed, with the detached certainty of a financial projection, that the property would be available for transfer within 12 to 18 months of the older occupant's death. The older occupant was me. The one in declining health was Maggie. Victoria had written about Maggie's illness the way an investor writes about a market condition, as a variable in a calculation, a factor that would resolve itself on a predictable schedule. Maggie wrote, "I sat at this table, and I read those emails. And I want you to know that I did not cry. I was not angry. I was clear. I was the clearest I have been since the diagnosis. I understood exactly what was happening, and I understood exactly what I needed to do, and I felt something I had not felt in months, which was purpose. Not the kind of purpose that comes from fighting the cancer, because I had already accepted that fight was not mine to win. A different kind of purpose. The kind that comes from knowing that the house your grandfather built, the house that kept people safe for 100 years, the house where you raised your son and loved your husband and did the work that mattered most to you, was being measured for demolition by a woman who had been in it 4 times and had never once asked about the stone. She wrote that she closed the laptop. She put her glasses on. She went to the reading room, and she sat in her chair, and she looked at the river, and she made a decision. She did not tell me. She did not confront Victoria. She did not call James. She called Helen Garza, who had been her friend since graduate school and who specialized in historic preservation law and land protection. And she said, "Helen, I need your help. They are going to come for the house. Not yet, but they will. And when they do, I need the house to be ready." She wrote, "I chose not to tell you because you would have confronted them immediately, and the confrontation would have been about anger and betrayal, and the anger would have been justified, but it would not have protected the house. Anger does not protect anything, Walt. It only burns. I needed something fireproof. I set the first 2 pages down. My hands were not shaking. I want to be clear about that. My hands were steady, the way hands are steady when the body understands that what is happening requires precision and not emotion. The whiskey sat untouched beside me. The ship's lantern threw its warm, steady light across the table, across Maggie's handwriting, across the blueprint of a house drawn by a man who carried stone on his back 100 years ago. 2 more pages to read. Maggie was still talking to me from inside the wall, from inside the envelope, from whatever place the dead go when they leave behind words that have not yet been heard. The 3rd page began differently. The first 2 pages had been explanation, the what and the why. Maggie laying out the facts the way she laid out her research, carefully, sequentially, making sure the reader understood the foundation before she built the next floor. But the 3rd page was something else. The handwriting was the same. The ink was the same. But the voice behind the words had shifted from the historian, explaining to the woman asking. She wrote, "I need you to understand what I did and why I did it this way and not another way. I contacted Helen in February, 14 months before I died. I know I am dead as you read this, and I am sorry to be so blunt about it, but there is no other way to say that sentence, and I have never believed in softening the truth when the truth is the point." She wrote that she and Helen had spent the first 3 months researching the legal framework for historic preservation in New York State. Helen explained the National Register of Historic Places, what it meant, what protections it offered, what it did not. The register did not prevent a private owner from demolishing their own property, but it triggered a federal review process for any project involving federal funding, federal licensing, or federal permits. It made the property eligible for historic preservation tax credits. And most importantly, it established a public record of the property's historical significance that could be used to rally community support, attract media attention, and create the kind of public pressure that developers avoid because public pressure costs more than any property is worth. Maggie wrote, "Helen told me the register alone would not stop them. I said I did not need it to stop them. I needed it to slow them down long enough for the story to get out." Helen asked me what story. I said the story of the house. She described what she did next. Over the course of 11 months, working between chemotherapy sessions and the days when she was well enough to sit at the reading room table for more than an hour at a time, Maggie compiled the most complete documentation of the house's history that had ever been assembled. She went back to Ellis Island, not physically. She was too ill for that. But through the digital archives that had been expanded since her earlier research. She found the original immigration records for Pietro Ferraro, dated 1919, listing his occupation as stonemason, his port of departure as Naples, his destination as Peekskill, New York. She found the employment records from the Bear Mountain Bridge construction project that listed the names and nationalities of the laborers. She cross-referenced those names with her own interview notes from 20 years of research and identified 17 families whose ancestors had passed through Pietro's house between 1920 and 1926. She contacted the descendants. Some she had spoken to before, years ago, during her earlier research. Others she found through genealogy, databases, and historical society records, and the particular patient detective work that Maggie excelled at because she believed that every person who ever lived deserved to have their presence in the world acknowledged. She collected photographs, letters, baptismal records, and 3 recorded oral histories from elderly descendants who remembered their grandparents speaking about the stone house by the river where an Italian family fed them and gave them a place to sleep. She compiled all of this into the application for the National Register. Helen handled the legal filings. The State Historic Preservation Office reviewed the application and sent an assessor to the house, which happened on a day I was in Rhinebeck working on a window restoration, a detail Maggie had planned around because she knew my schedule, and she knew that if I saw a state assessor walking through the house, I would ask questions she was not yet ready to answer. She wrote, "I know you will be angry that I did this without telling you. I know you will feel that I kept a secret. I did keep a secret. I kept it because I needed you to find the envelope at the right time, and the right time was not while I was alive. The right time was when they came for the house. If I had told you while I was alive, you would have confronted James. You would have confronted Victoria, and the confrontation would have been about betrayal. And the betrayal is real, but the betrayal is not the point. The house is the point. The story is the point." She wrote, "This house saved people, Walt. Your great-grandfather-in-law built it with stone and sweat and the goodwill of men who had nothing but each other, and it became a place where people who were lost could stop and rest and eat a meal and remember that they were not alone. That is what this house is. That is what it has always been. It does not need to be saved by lawyers. It needs to be saved by its story. When the time comes, tell the story. Helen will handle the rest." The 4th page was shorter. The handwriting was slightly less steady. Not shaking, but softer at the edges. The way letters look when they are written slowly, with care, by someone who knows this is the last page. She wrote, "I hid this envelope in the wall between the kitchen and the hallway because that section has been showing signs of moisture damage for 2 years. And I know you, Walt. I know you will get to it eventually because you cannot leave a damaged wall unrepaired any more than you can leave a broken promise unkept. You will find this envelope because you are the kind of man who fixes things. That is who you are. That is who I married." She wrote, "Rebuild what they are trying to tear down. Not just the walls. The memory. Put Pietro's name back on the house. Tell the story of the families who came through. Make the history visible so that no one can pretend it was not there. And then, when the house is safe, write the next page. I have filled 14 journals. The 15th is yours." She signed it, Maggie, and beneath her name, in smaller letters, "I loved every minute of it. Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones." I placed the letter on the table. I placed it beside the blueprint from 1920 and the National Register certificate and the printed email from Victoria. 4 documents, 4 layers of a single story, built the way this house was built, stone by stone, each one placed by hand, each one load-bearing. I sat at the kitchen table for the rest of the night. I did not sleep. I did not drink the whiskey. I sat with the lantern light, and Maggie's voice still alive on the pages in front of me, and the river making the small sounds it makes in the dark, the sound of water passing over stone that has been there long enough to have forgotten it was ever anywhere else. At 6 in the morning, headlights swept across the kitchen window. Tires on gravel. A car door. Footsteps on the porch that were unhurried and deliberate. The walk of someone who had been ready for this morning for a very long time. I opened the front door. Helen Garza stood on the porch holding 2 document cases and a paper bag from the bakery in Beacon. She looked at my face, and she did not ask whether I had read the letter. She said, "I brought bagels. No one makes good decisions on an empty stomach." Helen Garza drove a dark green Subaru Outback that she had never washed in the 4 years she had owned it. And when I mentioned this once, she said that life contained a limited number of hours, and she had decided early on that none of hers would be spent making a car look like it had not been driven. She was 59 years old. She was small, 5'3" at most, with silver-streaked black hair cut short, and practical, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck that she put on and took off, with the automatic rhythm of someone who reads documents the way other people breathe. She had been Maggie's friend since graduate school at Columbia, where they had studied in adjacent departments and discovered they shared an interest in the places where law and history intersect, which is most places if you are paying attention. She set the bagels on the kitchen table next to Maggie's letter, and the blueprint and the National Register certificate, and the email from Victoria. She poured herself coffee from the pot I had made an hour earlier, and she sat down across from me, and she ate half a bagel before she said a word about any of it. When she finished, she wiped her hands on a paper napkin and opened the first document case. She said, "Let me tell you what you have and what it means. The National Register listing," she explained, "did not technically prevent the owner of a private property from altering or demolishing it. That was a common misconception. What it did was significantly more useful in a case like this. Any project that involved federal funding, federal permits, or federal licensing was required to undergo a review process under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act before any work could proceed. A boutique riverside resort of the scale Sterling River Development was proposing would almost certainly require Army Corps of Engineers permits for any work near the waterline, Environmental Protection Agency review for any demolition involving structures built before 1978 due to lead paint and asbestos protocols, and potentially Federal Highway Administration review if any access road modifications required federal transportation funds. Each of those triggers initiated an independent review process. Each review process took months. Each one created a public comment period during which community members, historical societies, and preservation organizations could file objections. She said, "The register does not build a wall around the house. It builds a maze around the developer. And most developers, when they see the maze, decide the property is not worth the time." But that was the defensive position. Helen said Maggie had understood that defense alone was not enough. Defense slows things down. What stops things is offense, and offense in a case like this meant establishing that the listing itself was fraudulent. She opened the second document case. Inside was a title search she had commissioned the previous week. After I called her from the restaurant parking lot, she had contacted a title company she worked with regularly, a firm that specialized in historic properties and understood the urgency of the request, and they had completed the search in 5 days. The results, she said, were interesting. She said interesting the way a structural engineer says interesting when they find a crack in a foundation wall. Which is to say, she meant it was very bad for someone who was not us. Victoria had signed a listing agreement with a brokerage firm affiliated with Sterling River Development. The agreement authorized the broker to market the property for sale at $1.2 million. In order to sign that agreement, Victoria had presented the brokerage with a power of attorney document that purported to grant her the legal authority to act on behalf of the property owner, which was me, through my son James, who was listed as the grantor of the power. The power of attorney was dated 6 months ago. It bore what appeared to be James's signature. Helen set the document on the table. She said, "I called James this morning at 5:30. I apologize for not telling you first, but the timeline required it. I read him the relevant section of the power of attorney, and I asked him whether he had signed it. He said he had not. He said he had never seen the document. He said he did not know what a power of attorney was in this context." His voice, Helen said, had the quality of a man who is hearing something for the first time and recognizing it as something he should have heard a long time ago. I asked her whether James was telling the truth. She said she believed he was, based on the conversation and based on a secondary finding in the title search. Victoria had also contacted a bank, presenting the power of attorney and the listing agreement as evidence of an impending sale, and had requested a preliminary appraisal of the property. The appraisal request specified that the valuation should be based on planned demolition and new construction rather than the existing structure, which meant Victoria had told the bank she intended to tear the house down before selling the land. This was significant, Helen said, because it meant the $1.2 million figure was not based on what the house was worth. It was based on what the land was worth without the house on it. She closed the document case. She placed both hands flat on the table, the way I had placed my hand on Victoria's email the night before, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who has been doing this work for 30 years and still finds it necessary to pause before saying the next sentence. She said, "Walt, this is not a family disagreement anymore. This is fraud. The power of attorney is forged. The listing agreement is based on a fraudulent instrument. The appraisal request misrepresents the intended use of the property, and the entire scheme was initiated while your wife was still alive by a woman who was calculating the timeline of your wife's death as a business variable. She said she was not telling me this to upset me. She was telling me because the response needed to be proportional to the offense. And the offense was not a daughter-in-law overstepping her boundaries. The offense was a criminal act committed against a property that was both privately owned and federally recognized as historically significant. I asked her what we did next. She said we waited. I said I was not good at waiting. She said she knew, but that waiting was sometimes the most strategic thing a person could do, and that in this case the person we were waiting for had already announced her next move. My phone buzzed on the table. A text message from Victoria, sent to both me and James. It read, "We will be at the house at 2 p.m. tomorrow, with the Sterling River team to finalize the walkthrough and paperwork. Please have your personal items organized. The movers can come Thursday." Helen read the message over my shoulder. She took off her reading glasses. She set them on the table next to the blueprint from 1920 and the letter from my dead wife and the title search that documented the fraud committed against the house my great-grandfather-in-law built with stone carried on it back from the river. She said, "Perfect. We will be ready too." Victoria arrived at 1:53, 7 minutes early. She drove a black SUV that looked like it had been detailed that morning, the kind of vehicle that announces its driver before the door opens. Behind her, a silver sedan pulled into the gravel drive carrying 3 men in dark suits who got out with the coordinated efficiency of people who visit properties professionally and have learned to project authority through posture and eye contact, and the way they hold their document folders close to the body, like evidence. Victoria stepped out of the SUV. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse and red heels. The heels clicked on the flagstone path that leads from the drive to the porch, the path Pietro laid with flat stones from the riverbank, and I watched her walk toward the house in shoes that were not designed for flagstone or gravel or any surface that was not a polished floor, and I thought about the crescent-shaped scuff mark on my parlor hardwood, the one I had found after my appointment in Poughkeepsie. And I knew with certainty that the mark had been made by those shoes, on that floor, in my house, while I was gone. Helen and I were sitting on the porch. We had been there since noon, drinking coffee, reviewing documents, watching the river, and saying very little because there was very little left to say. Helen had arranged her 2 document cases on the small wooden table between our chairs, one on top of the other, and she sat with her reading glasses on and a legal pad in her lap on which she had written nothing because she did not need notes for what was about to happen. Victoria saw Helen first. She slowed her walk for half a step, the kind of hesitation you would miss if you were not watching for it. And then she resumed her pace and came up the porch steps and looked at me, and then at Helen, and said, "Who is this?" I said, "This is Helen Garza. She is an attorney." Victoria said, "We have attorneys." She turned to the Sterling River men, who had reached the bottom of the porch steps and were standing in a loose formation, folders in hand, looking at Helen with the cautious expression of professionals who have encountered unexpected variables before and have learned that unexpected variables usually mean the timeline is about to change. Victoria introduced them. The tallest one, a man with graying hair and a handshake that was firm in the way handshakes are firm when they are performing confidence rather than expressing it, said he was the project director for Sterling River Development's Hudson Valley Division. He said they were looking forward to finalizing the walkthrough. He said the property had tremendous potential. He said the word potential, the way Victoria had said the word comfortable at the restaurant, as a word that meant something different from what it appeared to mean. Victoria reached into her leather portfolio and produced a folder. She set it on the porch railing and opened it and began explaining the timeline. Walkthrough today. Final signatures by end of week. Demolition assessment to follow. Construction permits filed by January. She spoke with the rehearsed fluency of someone who has given this presentation before and expects no interruptions. I reached into the document case on the table. I removed a single sheet of paper in a clear protective sleeve. I set it on the porch railing beside Victoria's folder. I did not say anything. I let the document speak. The project director picked it up. He read it. He read it again. He turned it over, as if expecting something on the back that would undo what was on the front. He looked at the address on the document. He looked at the house. He looked at me. He said, "This property is on the National Register?" I said, "It has been for nearly 5 years." The project director set the document down. He looked at Victoria. The look was not hostile. It was the look of a man recalculating. He said, "Victoria, were you aware of this? Because this changes the feasibility analysis considerably." Victoria picked up the National Register certificate. She read it with the rapid scanning motion of someone looking for an error, a loophole, something that would allow her to set it aside and continue with the presentation she had prepared. She did not find one. The certificate was issued by the United States Department of the Interior. It bore the seal of the National Park Service. It referenced a documentation package that ran to 214 pages. She said, "This must be a mistake. This was never discussed. My father-in-law does not have the authority to register this property without family consultation." Helen spoke for the first time. She did it without standing, without raising her voice, without removing her reading glasses. She said, "The registration was completed by Margaret Simmons, the property owner of record at the time of filing, in full compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. The property owner is not required to consult family members before placing a property on the National Register. The registration is valid, permanent, and not subject to appeal by anyone other than the property owner of record, which is now Mr. Simmons." The project director closed his folder. He placed it under his arm. He said, "Victoria, I think we need to pause this process." He looked at me and said he apologized for the inconvenience and that his team would need to reevaluate the project parameters. He gestured to the 2 men behind him. They turned. They walked back to the silver sedan. They did not look at the house the way people look at houses they intend to buy. They looked at it the way people look at something they have just realized they cannot have. Victoria watched them go. The composure she had arrived with was still intact, but it had changed texture. The way a wall looks the same from a distance but feels different when you put your hand on it and realize the plaster beneath the paint has begun to separate. She turned to Helen. Her voice dropped half a register. She said, "Who are you exactly? And who authorized you to interfere with a private family matter?" Helen reached down and opened the second document case. She placed it on the table beside the first. She lifted the cover and removed a bound file, roughly an inch thick. She set it on the porch railing in the exact spot where the project director had set down his folder. She said, "My name is Helen Garza. I am an attorney, specializing in historic preservation and land protection law. I was retained by Margaret Simmons approximately 5 years ago to provide ongoing legal stewardship of this property. And what I have here," she tapped the bound file with one finger, "is what I found when I ran a title search on this property last week. Now, let me show you what else we found." Helen set the bound file on the porch railing with the unhurried precision of a woman who has done this before, in rooms with higher stakes and louder voices, and who has learned that the quieter you are when you deliver bad news, the louder it lands. She opened the file to the first tabbed section. She said, 6 months ago, a listing agreement was signed with a brokerage firm affiliated with Sterling River Development, authorizing the marketing and sale of this property at a price of $1.2 million. In order to execute that agreement, a power of attorney document was presented to the brokerage, purporting to grant legal authority to act on behalf of the property owner through his son, James Simmons. She removed the power of attorney from the file and placed it on the railing. She said, "I spoke with James Simmons at 5:30 this morning. He confirmed that he did not sign this document. He confirmed that he had never seen this document. He confirmed that he did not authorize anyone to sign on his behalf." Victoria said nothing. She was looking at the power of attorney, the way a person looks at a photograph of themselves doing something they do not remember doing, with a mixture of recognition and distance, as if the document belonged to a version of herself she had not expected to encounter in daylight. Helen continued. She turned to the second tab section. She said, "In connection with the listing, a request was submitted to a bank for a preliminary appraisal of the property. The appraisal request specified that the valuation should be based on," and she read directly from the document, "planned demolition of existing structure and new construction on cleared parcel." She looked up. She said, "This means the bank was told that the existing house, the house we are standing in front of, the house that has been on the National Register of Historic Places for nearly 5 years, was going to be torn down. The valuation of $1.2 million is not the value of this house. It is the value of this land without this house on it." She turned to the third tab section. She said, "The power of attorney document contains a signature that purports to be James Simmons. A preliminary analysis by a forensic document specialist retained by my office indicates that the signature exhibits characteristics inconsistent with known samples of James Simmons's handwriting." She paused. She said, "In plain language, the signature appears to be forged." Victoria's face went through 3 changes in quick succession. The first was the expression of someone who has been caught, but has not yet accepted that being caught is what is happening. The second was a calculation, visible and rapid, the eyes moving from Helen to me to the file on the railing and back, scanning for the exit that must exist because exits always exist. The third was anger, which arrived not as an explosion but as a tightening, a pulling inward. The way a structure shifts when the load it is bearing exceeds the capacity it was designed for. She said, "This is absurd." She said, "James knew about all of this." She said, "We discussed it together." She said, "He agreed." Helen said, "He agreed to what?" "Specifically," Victoria said, "he agreed that the property should be sold. He agreed that his father was not capable of maintaining it. He agreed that the proceeds would benefit the family." Helen said, "Did he agree to have his signature forged on a power of attorney document?" Victoria did not answer that question. Instead, she turned toward the house, toward the front door, where James had been standing for the past several minutes. I had not seen him arrive. I do not know how long he had been there. He was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, the old oak frame that Pietro had shaped with a drawknife, and he was looking at Victoria with the expression of a man who is watching something he built collapse and cannot decide whether to run toward it or away from it. Victoria said his name. She said it the way you say a word, when you need it to do something for you. To open a door or close one. To confirm a story or deny an accusation. She said, "James, tell them. Tell them you knew. Tell them we discussed this." James said nothing for a moment. His hand tightened on the door frame. Then he said, quietly, "I knew about the plan to sell. I did not know about the power of attorney. I did not sign that document." Victoria's face changed again. The calculation I had seen before returned, but this time it was faster, more desperate, the calculation of someone who has just lost their primary witness and is rapidly reassessing which version of the story can survive without it. She said, "You signed papers. You signed multiple documents. You knew what they were." James said, You told me they were standard transfer documents. You said they were routine. I trusted you. Helen said nothing. She did not need to. She sat in her chair on the porch with her reading glasses on and her legal pad in her lap, and she let the conversation continue because the conversation was doing her work for her. Victoria turned back to me. The anger had shifted into something harder to name, something that was part fury and part fear, and part the particular bitterness of someone who has been outmaneuvered by a dead woman and a man she had dismissed as irrelevant. She said, "You think you have won something. You think keeping this pile of rocks is a victory." She gestured at the house behind her, at the stone walls that Pietro laid 100 years ago, at the oak lintels and the slate roof and the windows through which Maggie had watched the river for 40 years. She said, "This house is falling apart. It needs a fortune in repairs. It will bankrupt you. And for what? For the memory of a woman who is not coming back? For a pile of immigration records nobody cares about?" She said, "You chose a dead woman's rock pile over your own son's future." I did not respond. There are sentences that do not deserve responses. And there are sentences that answer themselves. And that sentence was both. Helen closed the file. She placed it back in the document case. She said, "Mrs. Simmons, I would strongly advise you to retain an attorney. The forged power of attorney and the fraudulent listing constitute criminal acts under New York state law. My office will be referring the matter to the county district attorney's office on Monday. You will be contacted." Victoria looked at James one more time. He was still standing in the doorway. He had not moved toward her. He had not moved toward me. He was standing in the exact center of the frame, between the inside and the outside, between the house he grew up in and the woman he had married, and he did not move. She turned. She walked down the porch steps. Her red heels clicked on Pietro's flagstone path. Faster now, the rhythm of a person who is no longer arriving but leaving. She got into the black SUV. She closed the door. She pulled out of the gravel drive without looking back at the house or at the man still standing in its doorway. The engine faded. The gravel settled. The river continued its quiet passage, south toward the sea. 3 of the neighbors who had gathered at the edge of the property line exchanged glances and began slowly walking back to their own houses, carrying with them a story they would tell at dinner tables and in grocery store aisles for a very long time. James was still standing in the doorway. Helen began packing her document cases. She worked quietly, methodically, the way she did everything. She did not look at James. She did not look at me. She gave us the silence we needed, which was one of the many things I would come to appreciate about Helen Garza, her understanding that sometimes the most important legal counsel you can provide is the space to not say anything at all. Helen was not only a lawyer, she was a woman who understood, the way Maggie had understood, that the most durable protection you can give a building is not a legal filing, or a lock, or a fence. It is a story that people care about enough to repeat. A building with a story becomes a building with witnesses, and witnesses are harder to evict than tenants. 3 days after the confrontation on the porch, Helen called a reporter at the Hudson Valley Register named Sarah Cowrie. Sarah was 31 years old, had been covering local development disputes for 4 years, and had a reputation for writing stories about places that developers wanted to erase and communities wanted to keep. Helen told her about the house, not about the fraud, which was now a matter for the district attorney and could not be discussed publicly. She told her about the history, about Pietro Ferraro and the stone he carried from the river, about the bridge workers and the way station, about the families who had passed through, about Maggie's 20 years of research. Sarah came to the house on a Saturday morning in early November. She brought a photographer. They spent 4 hours. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, and I showed her Maggie's journals, the ones I had begun reading in order now, cover to cover, one per week, the way you read something sacred when you finally accept that it is sacred. She photographed the pages. She photographed the stone walls. She photographed the blueprint from 1920 still in its protective sleeve, Pietro's handwriting in the corner. She stood on the porch and looked at the river, and she said this was the kind of story she had been waiting to find since she started this job. The article ran the following Thursday. It was titled, "The Stone House That Kept People Safe," and it opened with a photograph of the front of the house taken from the riverbank, the stone walls golden in the late autumn light, the sycamores bare along the shore, the ridge behind it, still carrying the last color of the season. The article was 3,000 words long. It told the story of Pietro and Lucia. It told the story of the bridge workers. It told the story of Maggie's research. It did not mention Victoria, or the attempted sale, or the fraud. It did not need to. The story stood on its own, the way the house stood on its own, because when something has been standing for 100 years, you do not need to explain why it should keep standing. You just need to remind people that it is there. The article was shared 4,000 times in the first week. Then a regional paper picked it up. Then a public radio station in Albany did a segment. Then a history podcast based in Brooklyn contacted me and asked if they could do an episode about the house and the bridge and the immigrant families. And I said yes, because Maggie had said it clearly. The house needs to be saved by its story. The descendants started calling. That was the part I had not anticipated, and the part that changed everything. A woman in New Jersey named Rosa Amato called on a Tuesday evening and said her grandfather had been one of the bridge workers, and that her grandmother had told her about the stone house by the river, where they slept for 2 weeks in the winter of 1923, and where the Italian woman, Lucia, had given her grandfather a wool blanket because his coat was not warm enough for a New York winter. Rosa was crying when she told me this. She said her grandmother had kept the blanket until she died. A man in Connecticut named Patrick Dwyer sent me a letter with a photograph inside. The photograph showed 4 men standing in front of the house in what appeared to be 1924, based on the construction visible on the bridge in the background. One of the men was his great-grandfather, an Irish stonecutter named Seamus Dwyer. And on the back of the photograph someone had written in pencil, "Pietro's house. March 24. Good people." A woman named Agnes Ballow drove 4 hours from Bridgeport, Connecticut. She was 80 years old. She walked slowly up the flagstone path, and she stood in front of the house, and she looked at the stone walls, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "My grandfather was a Hungarian carpenter named Andras Kovacs. He worked on the bridge in the winter of 23 and 24. He wrote a letter to my grandmother in Budapest about this house. He said the Italian man and his wife fed him dinner every night for 3 weeks and would not take a single cent." She paused. She said, "My grandfather told my grandmother that this house was the first place in America where someone offered him a chair. I stood beside her on the path, and I did not trust myself to speak." Agnes reached into her purse and removed a photocopy of the letter. She said she had brought it for me. She said she wanted the house to have it. I took it and held it. And I thought about Maggie, who had found a reference to that same letter in an archive 20 years ago, and had written about it in Journal Number 7, and who had known that the story of this house was not a local curiosity, but a living document of what this country was supposed to be. The community organized a petition to formally recognize the house as a local historic landmark, gathered 1,200 signatures in 2 weeks. The Cold Spring Historical Society passed a resolution supporting the preservation. 3 local businesses offered to sponsor restoration work. Sterling River Development, which had already withdrawn from the project after the National Register revelation, issued a brief public statement, saying they had no further interest in the property and wished the community well. In the evenings, after the reporters and the descendants and the well-wishers had gone, I sat on the porch and read Maggie's journals. I was in journal number 11 now, the one that covered her research into the families who had stayed in the house in 1922, the year before the bridge construction began in earnest, when Pietro was still taking in travelers and seasonal workers who passed through the valley looking for work. Maggie had documented 7 families from that year. with names and dates and the fragments of stories she had pieced together from census records and church registries, and the memories of people who remembered being told things by people who were there. One name stopped me. It appeared 3 times in Journal 11, once in a list of overnight guests documented through a church ledger in Peekskill, once in a margin note cross, referencing an Ellis Island arrival record, and once in a paragraph Maggie had written about a young stoneworker from Spain who had stayed at the house for 6 weeks in the autumn of 1922 and had helped Pietro repair the chimney flue before moving north to work on a dam project in the Adirondacks. The name was Tomas Garza. Arrived Ellis Island, 1921. Occupation: cantero, stonecutter. From a village in Galicia, Spain. Garza. I read the name again. I set the journal down on my lap and looked at the river, and I said the name out loud in the dark. Garza. Like Helen Garza. But before any of that, before the article and the descendants and the name in the journal that would change everything, there was the evening after the confrontation on the porch. There was my son. James did not leave after Victoria drove away. I had expected him to follow her, because that was the pattern of the last 5 years, Victoria deciding, and James following. But he did not follow her. He stood in the doorway for a long time after the sound of her engine faded, and then he stepped outside, and sat on the top step of the porch, and put his head in his hands. Helen left quietly. She carried her document cases to the Subaru, and looked at me once through the window, with an expression that said, "This part is yours." She drove away. The light was going, the early dark of late October, and the river was turning the deep gray it turns when the sun drops behind the ridge and the sky holds the last of the color the water has already given up. I sat in my chair. James sat on the step below me, close enough that I could have put my hand on his shoulder the way I used to when he was young. I did not reach out. I needed to know what he would say before I knew what my hand should do. He spoke without looking at me. His voice was low and flat, stripped of the performance that had characterized every conversation we had for 5 years. The cheerful deflections and the fine, everything is fine. What was left underneath was a voice I had not heard in a long time. His actual voice. The one that sounded like mine. He said he had known about the plan to sell the house. Victoria had brought it up 2 years ago. Framed as a financial decision. The kind adults make when they look at the numbers and accept that sentiment cannot justify the expense. He said he had resisted at first. Told her the house meant something. She had listened patiently and then shown him a spreadsheet comparing maintenance costs against the projected sale price, and the numbers had been so clear that his resistance felt irrational. He said she was very good at making feelings feel irrational. He said he had not known about the power of attorney. She had given him documents to sign on 3 occasions over the past year, described as standard estate planning paperwork. He had signed them because she told him they were routine, and because trusting her was easier than reading the fine print, and discovering it said something he did not want to know. He said, that was a choice. He knew it was a choice. He said he had been part of the plan to move me to Arizona. He had told himself it was for my benefit, that the winters were hard, the house too much for one person. I told him that might have been partly true, and that it did not make it less of a plan to remove me from the property they wanted to sell. He said he knew that. The river made its sounds at dusk, soft lapping against the stone shore. I waited. I have learned from 40 years of restoration that the most important information comes after the silence, not before it. He said, I stopped reading Mom's journals because every time I opened one, I could hear her voice. And hearing her voice made me remember who I was before. And remembering who I was before made it impossible to keep being who Victoria needed me to be. So I stopped. He said, that was the worst choice I made. Worse than the house. Worse than Arizona. I chose to stop hearing my mother's voice because it was inconvenient. I let that sentence sit in the air between us with the weight it deserved. Then I told him what I had wanted to say all evening. I said, This house was built in 1920 by a man named Pietro Ferraro, who did not speak the language, in a country that did not want him, with stone he carried on his back from the river. He built it by hand. He built it with favors and sweat, and the kind of stubbornness that does not know it is stubbornness, because it is simply the refusal to stop. The house he built has lasted 100 years. If Pietro could build something that lasted 100 years starting from nothing, you can probably figure out how to rebuild what you broke. He sat with the words the way you sit with something heavy. Then he asked the question I had known was coming since Helen opened the second document case. He said, "Did Mom know?" About Victoria, I was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the last light left the ridge and the river went dark, and the first stars appeared over the eastern bank. I said, "Your mother knew everything. She always did." James made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath. It was the sound a man makes when something he has been holding for a long time finally breaks open. Not violently, but completely. The way ice breaks on the river in March, all at once along lines that were already there. He put his face in his hands and he cried. Not the controlled grief of the funeral, where he had kept his composure because Victoria was watching. This was the other kind. The kind that comes when you stop performing your grief and let it be what it actually is. I put my hand on his shoulder. I did not say anything. I kept it there while the river moved past in the dark, and my son cried on the porch of the house his great-great-grandfather built. We sat for a long time. I did not tell him everything was forgiven because it was not. I told him I did not hate him. I told him what he had done would require more than an apology. I told him I would need time, and he would need to show me things rather than tell me things. And that showing was harder than telling, but it was the only currency I was willing to accept. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. He said it the way you say something when you mean it completely, and know completely that it is not enough. He left that night. I did not ask where he went. I sat on the porch until the cold drove me inside. I slept in the upstairs bedroom with the window cracked open because Maggie had always slept with the window open, even in October. Even when I told her the heating bill would be unreasonable, and she had said that the sound of the river was worth any bill, and that some expenses are not expenses at all, but investments in remaining human. Winter in the Hudson Valley is not beautiful in the way most people mean when they use that word. It is not picturesque. It is not charming. The river does not sparkle. The trees do not frame anything. The sky is a flat white that presses down on the landscape like a lid, and the cold comes in through every gap in every wall no matter how well you have sealed them, because cold is patient and wood is not, and the argument between them is as old as the first house anyone ever built. But there is a different kind of beauty in it if you stay long enough to see it. The way the stone walls of the house hold warmth long after the wood stove has died down. Because stone remembers heat, the way it remembers everything, slowly and completely. The way the river narrows and slows and the ice forms at the edges in patterns that look like handwriting, like the water is composing something it will erase in March. The way the bare sycamores along the bank reveal the architecture of their branches, the structure that was there all along beneath the leaves, hidden by the very thing that made them beautiful in summer. I spent that winter reading Maggie's journals, all 14 of them, in order, from the first entry in the summer of 1989, when she began documenting the house's history as what she called a weekend project that quickly became something else, to the last entry in the 14th journal, written 11 days before she died, in handwriting that had grown smaller and more deliberate, as if she were conserving the energy required to form each letter. I read one journal per week. I sat in the reading room where she had sat, in the chair that still carried the impression of her weight in the cushion, and I read by the light that came through the window she had chosen because it faced the river. I read about Pietro and Lucia. I read about the bridge workers. I read about the families who came and went, their names and origins, and the fragments of their stories that Maggie had assembled from church records and census documents, and the memories of people who remembered being told things by people who were there. I read, and I repaired. That was my winter. reading, and repairing. I replaced the rotted sill plate on the north side of the house, a job I had been putting off for 2 years. I repointed the mortar between the stones along the east wall, where the freeze and thaw cycles had opened gaps wide enough to slide a finger into. I rebuilt the third step of the porch staircase, the one that had been sagging since before Maggie died, and that she used to step over with a small hop that made her look like a girl. Even at 60, the work kept me honest. That is the only way I can describe it. Grief has a way of turning inward, of becoming a room you furnish with memories and then refuse to leave. The work forced me out of that room every morning and into the cold and the wind and the reality of a house that needed me to do something other than remember. James called in November. 20 minutes. Mostly logistical. He had moved to Philadelphia, taken a job with a small consulting firm that had no connection to technology or Austin or anything Victoria had chosen for him. He sounded like a man who is learning to use his own voice again after years of lip-syncing to someone else's words. He asked about the house. I told him about the sill plate. He said he remembered the sill plate, which surprised me because I did not think he had been paying attention the last time I mentioned it, which was 4 years ago. He called again in December. Longer, harder, closer to the conversation that needed to happen. He said he had hired his own attorney to cooperate with the district attorney's investigation. He said the forensic analysis of the power of attorney had confirmed the signature was forged. He said Victoria had retained counsel and was contesting the fraud charges. He said the process was slow and administrative and entirely devoid of drama, which is how serious legal consequences work. Just paper and time. He asked if he could come to the house in January. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday morning with a duffel bag and a 6-pack of the local beer from a brewery in Beacon that Maggie used to like. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room the way a person looks at a place they are seeing clearly for the first time, even though they have been there 100 times before. He said the house looked good. I said I had been working on it. He said he could tell. I handed him journal number 1. I said, "Start here." He sat in the reading room. He read for 6 hours. He did not speak. He did not check his phone. He sat in a chair across from Maggie's chair, and he read his mother's handwriting, and I could hear him turning the pages from the kitchen where I was repointing the hearth. The soft sound of paper moving under fingers that were learning to be careful with something they should have been careful with a long time ago. That evening he found the entry in Journal 14. The last journal. The one Maggie was writing when she died. He came into the kitchen holding it open to a page near the end. A page I had not yet reached in my own reading, because I was saving the last journal, the way you save the last chapter of a book you do not want to finish. He said, "Dad, look at this." It was a margin note in Maggie's hand, written in pencil rather than ink, the way she wrote things she intended to verify later. It said, "Tomas Garza, confirmed connection. Helen's great-grandfather. Ellis Island, 1921. Stayed at the house autumn 1922. Helped Pietro with the chimney. Moved north to dam project. See journal. 11 pages. 43 through 47. James looked at me. He said, "Garza. Like Helen Garza. Like the attorney." I called Helen that evening. I stood on the porch in the January cold with the phone against my ear, and the stars sharp and close in the way. They only get in winter when the air is dry, and the light pollution is low enough that you can see the arm of the galaxy stretching across the sky like a road to somewhere you cannot drive. I said, "Did you know your great-grandfather lived in this house?" Helen was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of surprise. The quiet of someone deciding how much of a story to tell. She said, "Maggie told me. The week before she died. That is why I agreed to help her." March came the way it always does in the Hudson Valley. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments between winter and whatever follows it. Snow would melt along the south side of the house by noon, then freeze again before dark. The river loosened in sections. gray water pushing through white seams of ice like something trying to remember how to move. I stood on the porch one morning and realized I was not looking at the house the way I used to. For 3.5 years, I had seen it as the place where Maggie had lived. Now I was beginning to see it as something she had been building long after she stopped breathing. The sign took me 11 days. I chose white oak because it weathers slowly and because Pietro Ferraro would have approved. I carved the letters by hand with a 1/4-inch chisel, the same tool I had used on restoration projects for 40 years. The grain fought me in 2 places, which is how you know the wood is honest. When I finished, I mounted it on 2 hand-forged iron brackets beside the front door. It read, "The Ferraro House, established 1920. A place of shelter, craft, and memory. In honor of Margaret Simmons, who listened." The first floor became a living museum, though I never used that word. I called it the front room, because that is what Pietro and Lucia Ferraro would have called it. I framed Pietro's original 1920 blueprint in reclaimed chestnut and hung it on the east wall, where the morning light would reach it first. Beside it, I placed the 1924 photograph that Patrick Dwyer had mailed from Connecticut. 4 men, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the porch, one of them holding a trowel. On the opposite wall, I mounted a glass case containing Agnes Ballow's photocopied letter from her grandfather and a small portrait of Andras Kovacs, taken the year he arrived. Rosa Amato's wool blanket, the one Lucia had given her grandfather during his first winter working on the Bear Mountain Bridge, sat in an acid-free display case near the reading room door. I placed 3 of Maggie's journals on the table beneath the window, open to pages she had marked with small pencil stars. The second floor I rebuilt for the living. I reinforced the floor joists with steel sister beams, installed proper lighting, and built 6 workbenches from reclaimed barn timber. Tool racks lined the north wall. A chalkboard covered the south wall. I wanted it to feel like a place where someone could learn to use their hands and understand why that mattered. The workshop opened on the first Saturday in April to anyone between the ages of 16 and 25. No tuition. No application. Just show up and be willing to learn. Frank Hobson came that first Saturday. He was 81 and his hands shook when he held a cup of coffee. But they steadied the moment he picked up a chisel. He taught 4 teenagers how to read the grain of bluestone before cutting it. He told them that Pietro Ferraro had known the same thing, that stone tells you where it wants to break if you are patient enough to listen. Agnes Ballow's grandson, a second-year student at Pratt, drove up from Brooklyn every other weekend to teach architectural drawing. He pinned Pietro's original blueprint to the chalkboard and asked the students to copy it freehand, explaining that a pencil teaches your eye to see what a computer never will. Sarah Cowrie wrote a second article for the Hudson Valley Register. She titled it, "The House That Teaches." The piece described the workshop, the museum, the fellowship that Helen Garza was building from the restructured assets of the trust Maggie had protected. Helen had spent 3 months on the paperwork. She filed the nonprofit registration, established the endowment, and wrote the charter for what we named the Margaret Simmons Heritage Fellowship. It would fund 2 graduate students per year in historic preservation, with priority given to applicants from working-class families. The first fellows would begin the following fall. James came back in late March. He arrived from Philadelphia on a Friday evening with a duffel bag and a 6-pack of Beacon Lager, and said nothing about why he had come. The next morning I found him in the second-floor workshop, sanding a length of white oak with long, even strokes. He did not ask for instruction. He simply worked. Over the following weeks, he learned Pietro's lime mortar recipe from a passage in Maggie's journal number 6, mixed his first batch in a wooden trough I had built, and applied it to a section of the east wall where the pointing had crumbled. On the 3rd Saturday, he stood at the chalkboard and taught 4 teenagers how to read a floor plan. I watched him from the doorway. He used his hands the way Maggie had used hers when she explained something she loved. He did not notice me watching. We did not talk about Victoria. We did not talk about forgiveness. We talked about mortar and grain and the way a floor joist carries weight across a span. That was enough. Some conversations do not need words. They need sawdust and sweat and the sound of a chisel meeting stone at the correct angle. The space between us was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a wound. It was a joint, the kind where two pieces of wood meet at an angle and hold each other in place through pressure and precision rather than glue. On the last Saturday of April, Helen Garza pulled into the driveway in her unwashed dark green Subaru. She carried a leather portfolio and a sealed manila envelope. The portfolio contained the deed amendment, officially restoring the trust and designating the Ferraro house as a protected historic site under both state and federal preservation law. She placed it on the workbench and handed me a pen. I signed it beside the window where Maggie's journals sat open. Then she set the manila envelope on the table. It was old, slightly creased, and addressed in handwriting I did not recognize. She said, "I have been waiting to show you this until the house was ready." Maggie asked me to hold it. She found it inside Journal 14, pressed between pages 43 and 44. "I have not opened it." "She wanted you to." I turned the envelope over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line in Italian. I could not read it, but I recognized the handwriting from the 1920 blueprint mounted on the wall downstairs. It was Pietro Ferraro's. I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. The paper was brittle at the edges, yellowed the way documents yellow when they have spent a century pressed between pages in a room that is sometimes warm and sometimes cold. The pencil on the back had faded to a pale gray, but the letters were still legible. Helen stood beside the workbench with her arms folded, watching me the way she always did, with patience that never felt like waiting. James stood near the window. He had stopped sanding when Helen arrived and had not picked the sandpaper back up. I asked Helen if she knew what it said. She shook her head. "Maggie found it inside Journal 14, she said. "She told me about it the last time we spoke. She said it had been there the whole time, pressed flat between two pages about the 1922 growing season. She never translated it. She wanted you to be the one." I turned the envelope over and slid my thumb beneath the seal. The adhesive had long since dried, and the flap opened without resistance, the way old things give way when they have been holding on for long enough. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The paper was heavier than I expected, thick and rough, the kind of stock that a mason or a laborer might have purchased from a general store in 1920 or 1921. The writing was in Italian, small and careful, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write late and treated every letter as something worth getting right. I do not read Italian. But Agnes Balog's grandson, the Pratt student who had been teaching architectural drawing in the upstairs workshop, had studied a semester in Rome. He was downstairs in the front room adjusting a display frame when I called him up. He came to the workbench, looked at the letter, and read it slowly, translating as he went. The letter was addressed to no one. It had no date, no greeting. It began, simply, "I built this house with stone I carried from the river and the fields. Each stone I chose because it fit against the one beside it. I did not cut them to match. I found the ones that already belonged together. This is what I know about building. You do not force the material. You learn what it wants to become, and you help it get there. This house is not mine. I built it, but it belongs to whoever needs it next. A house is not a thing you own. It is a thing you take care of until someone else arrives who needs it more than you do. I came to this country with nothing but my hands and a name no one could pronounce. The first winter I slept in a barn in cold spring and ate what the farmers did not want. The second winter I slept in this house, in the room I built with my own hands. The third winter 12 men slept here, and Lucia fed every one of them, and not one of them was turned away. If you are reading this, then the house is still standing. That means someone has been taking care of it. I do not know your name. I do not know what year it is, but I know this. You are the kind of person who keeps things instead of throwing them away, who repairs instead of replaces, who believes that what came before you matters. I built this house for you. I did not know your name, but I built it for you." The Pratt student finished reading and set the letter down gently, as though it might dissolve. Helen removed her glasses and pressed them against her chest. James had not moved from the window. I looked at him and saw that his eyes were wet, and that he was not trying to hide it. No one spoke for what must have been 2 full minutes. The only sound was the April wind pressing against the east wall, the wall where James had repointed the mortar using Pietro's recipe, the wall that had stood for 106 years because a 24-year-old immigrant had chosen each stone by hand and trusted that the right ones would hold. I placed the letter back inside the envelope. I carried it downstairs and set it in the glass case beside Rosa Amato's wool blanket, beneath the 1920 blueprint, where the morning light would reach it first. I wrote a small card in pencil and placed it beside the envelope. It read, "Letter from Pietro Ferraro, circa 1921. Found by Margaret Simmons, inside Journal 14. Translated April. In the upstairs workshop of the house he built." That evening, I sat in the reading room with the 14 journals stacked on the table beside me. I opened a new notebook, the kind Maggie had always used, cloth-bound with unlined pages. I uncapped the fountain pen I had given her on our 10th anniversary, the one she had used to write every journal and every letter, including the 4 pages she had sealed inside the wall for me to find. The ink was still good. I pressed the nib to the first page and wrote, "Journal 15. The Ferraro House. Written by Walter Simmons, who learned to listen." I did not know what would come next. I did not know if James would stay, or if he would return to Philadelphia and come back on weekends, or if the distance between us would shrink slowly or never fully close. I did not know if Victoria would fight the criminal referral or disappear into whatever life she had been building parallel to the one she had tried to steal from us. I did not know how many students would walk through the workshop door next fall, or whether the fellowship would last 5 years or 50. But I knew what Pietro knew. You do not build for yourself. You build for the person you will never meet, the one who will walk through the door 100 years from now and feel the weight of the stones beneath their feet and understand, without being told, that someone cared enough to choose each one by hand. Maggie taught me that. She spent 20 years listening to a house tell its story, and then she spent her last 14 months making sure the story could not be erased. She did not fight with anger. She fought with patience and paper, and a 14-month conversation conducted entirely through handwritten letters with a woman whose great-grandfather had once slept under this roof. I wrote the first sentence of Journal 15, and then I stopped. Not because I did not know what to say, but because the house was quiet, and the evening light was coming through the west window the way it always does in April, warm and slanted and golden, and I wanted to sit inside that silence for as long as it would last. The pen was still in my hand. The page was open, and for the first time, in 3.5 years, I was not waiting for something. I was beginning. If you have ever fought to protect something that mattered more than money, something built by hands that are no longer here, something held together by memory and mortar and love, I would like to hear your story. Tell me in the comments what you have protected or what you wish you had. And if you know someone who is fighting that battle right now, share this with them. Sometimes the only thing standing between a legacy and a demolition crew is one person who refuses to let go. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories, like this one. There are more houses, more envelopes, more letters hidden inside walls, waiting for the right person to find them.